So let's start. Our first speaker is, as I said, Professor Helen Dixon, who teaches ancient Mediterranean history and museum studies at East Carolina University. She is also an external collaborator to the Center of Excellence in Ancient Near Eastern Empires, hosted here at the University of Helsinki. And Helen's top specialty is the history and culture of the Phoenicians in the first millennium BCE. And today she will enlighten us on the Phoenicians living abroad and their trading encounters. So Helen, the room is yours.
Thank you so much. Can everyone see the screen shared and hear my voice okay? Great. So today I'll be talking to you a little bit about diaspora communities in the first millennium Mediterranean world. And I think when we think about Phoenicians, the easy stuff that comes to mind are our early colonization efforts, those very first sort of comptoirs or stopover stations, and the inhabitants of those established Phoenician and eventually Punic colonies. That's how I teach my students about this particular sort of Mediterranean world is with maps like this that show Phoenicians at home here on the right and Phoenicians abroad in these sort of segregated blue zones that can come very near the green but not overlap. But I would like to investigate with you and sort of nod to some larger research I'm doing on three other types of Phoenicians abroad. First, inhabitants of established cities, foreign cities, where you have ethnic enclaves or minority communities that we could call Phoenicians if we were still using that term. Seasonal migrants or long distance traders. And in my ideal world, I would also go into soldiers abroad for months or years at a time, but time will limit what we can do. I want to start by sort of amplifying and also attributing some of the work I'm building upon. First is Ellen Sader's work, 2019 synthesis, The History and Archaeology of Phoenicia. Even though she's telling the story from the perspective of the Levantine Phoenicians, she is pulling together really diverse, dispersed, and multilingual sources on trade networks. Also, Dina Frangi-Joly, who is, actually this is an older article, 2016. She did some excellent work in the classical sources on particularly Phoenician roles in less well-studied trade routes, perfumes, aromatics, in addition to the sort of famous purple dye trade. And her work, each of these black dots represents a site that gets mentioned in this piece. She's talking about Phoenicians or their trading partners as far to the east as India, Pakistan, Iran, and so on, down into the Arabian Peninsula. And finally, Denise Demetrias, who just gave a talk live on YouTube last month in October on immigration and belonging Phoenician immigrants in 4th century BCE Athens. So she's using many of the sources I'll refer to today in terms of tombstone inscriptions, but she's working on a larger book project, I believe, that will synthesize even more diverse corpus. But I'd like to add some reading I've been doing, in preparation for, I'm writing a book, Death in Sidon, on mortuary culture and how that can be used to tell social history. And in trying to tell the story of Sidonians living abroad, I've been engaged with readings on diaspora theory. So some of this might be intuitive, or maybe you've read some of this material before, but just briefly, diaspora is defined, at least in terms of international organizations working on immigration, migration, and diaspora communities, as migrants or descendants of migrants whose identity and sense of belonging have been shaped by their migration experience and background. And diaspora theory looks at sort of a constellation of features shared by diaspora communities, and this can help us define and articulate diaspora communities in a wide world of adaptive behaviors, but it can also help us, I think, look at much more sparse evidence from the past and think in creative new ways about how we could interpret our inscription, especially our epigraphic corpus. So here are some essential elements sort of distilled from one of the, it's often used as a graduate student textbook, Cohen's 2008 Global Diasporas, an Introduction. You can find more about this set of theories and a bibliography at migrationdataportal.org. That's where I've sort of used as a starting point. Migration can be forced or voluntary from, and of course this is a little bit anachronistic, we're talking about nation states with these modern theoretical formulas or formulations. So migration from a country of origin in search of work, trade, or to escape conflict or persecution. And these next four, I think, are where I am focusing my efforts. We're talking about an idealized collective memory and or myth about the ancestral home. So recognizing that diaspora communities will often romanticize their homeland or stereotype their homeland as much as sort of foreign communities could. A continuing connection to a country of origin, that is a desire to stay connected and behaviors that follow that connection. But also a strong group consciousness sustained over time and a sense of kinship with diaspora members in other countries. And I'm going to explore some of these elements. This will just be sort of percolating in the background as I run through my formulation and just a sampling of data for you. Of course, let's first complain about it. Here are the challenges of the Phoenician data set. Of course, there's just not very much of it. We have very few Phoenician texts that are not inscribed in stone, which really limits what survives and the types of genres represented in the corpus. Of course, there is no country of origin. We are, as a field, sort of adjusting to a post-Phoenicianism, wherein we recognize that to talk about a self-conscious Phoenician identity in the Iron Age is pretty anachronistic, and that most folks, if they affiliated at all, would affiliate with their city-state, and yet we still call ourselves Phoenicians, and we still use the term because I always say we like to find each other in the programs of our conferences. Of course, the corpus of names is dominated by Punic evidence. It's an uneven corpus, a lot more data in terms of exemplars from Carthage, and it can be difficult to distinguish Phoenician from Punic origin communities. Of course, our Phoenician colonies have second and third generation colonies, right? Carthage sends out colonies to the west, etc. And of course, there are, because of the sparse data, because of its skewed nature of the corpus, and because we have so many formulaic tombstone inscriptions that do not offer context for titles or place names or month names, we have a lot of divergent interpretation in the scholarship, especially, and this is a nod to our next talk, surrounding festivals. So just for fun, one goofy example. This is a convention of Phoenician epigraphy that often it's published using square or Black Aramaic characters or Hebrew text. So this is the entirety of the inscription in Phoenician. We have a couple of Greek letters preserved, so we call it a bilingual dedication inscription found in a temple in Rhodes. But just this phrase, which has something to do with someone who raises the god, and then a bunch of letters, well, this title, which shows up in some other places, but we have no other sort of narrative text to explain what the heck this title is about, has been used to reconstruct a festival. And this is one of my favorite let's go nuts kind of explanations here. So this is Gibson's summary of Lipinski and Delcour's work, but they are attempting to reconstruct the complicated ritual of a Phoenician festival, which they believe originated in Tyre and took place in the spring. During this festival, the tomb of the god Melkart was burnt. How do you burn a tomb? Okay, on a funeral pyre. And thereafter, the king or a substitute figure had intercourse in a sacred marriage with a temple prostitute representing Ashtart, thus bringing about the resurrection of the god. The present titles identify the king's role in this ritual. So this is just a buffet of Near Eastern tropes around sacred prostitution, resurrection, and so on. And we have no idea what this phrase means. I actually just recently finished revisions on an article in which I propose it means the one who raises the god with the smells of Ashtart or similar, so equally crazy. Okay. Focusing on these two categories of Phoenicians abroad, I want to just, we don't have a lot of time today, but I'm going to present you with some sort of big picture snapshots of where this research is going so that we can discuss in more detail. And I want to start by emphasizing that even between these two categories, or if we're trying to distinguish soldiers and seasonal migrants or traders, we'll run into some troubles right away. So there's some excellent graffiti in temples in Egypt where you just have a name, a male name, 18 to 25-year-old men are sort of similar across time and space. I like to leave a little message that they were there. But in Arrian's Anabasis, another great example of this. So this is a, later reconstructed narrative about Alexander's conquests, and in discussing a fleet of Phoenician ships, right, using the Greek there, 47 ships in all, which came from Phoenicia, were deconstructed in order to be walked across land, rebuilt, and sailed to Babylon, right? So river-worthy along the Euphrates. That's the context. But in this particular passage here, our source, Aristobulus, says that Alexander cuts down, orders cypresses in Babylonian to be cut down, built another fleet. And here the yellow text, a multitude of purple fishers, I love that translation, and other seafaring men came to him from Phoenicia and the rest of the seaboard to serve as crews for the ships and perform other services on board. And then specifically, a sort of deputized Greek was dispatched to Phoenicia and Syria with 500 talents to enlist some men to purchase others who were experienced in nautical affairs. So here we have the hiring of professional traders, folks who work on ship crews, and these are maybe getting hired to be soldiers, but certainly getting hired to support military expeditions. There's going to be a lot of contact overlap and sort of fuzzy boundaries between these categories. But for what it's worth, let's have a little dip into the pool in terms of investigating these long-distance traders. So trying to summarize Phoenician trade, I think most of us again think westward to the sea. And there's a lot of evidence, especially late antique evidence, that trading by sea was exponentially cheaper than trading by land in the Mediterranean world. But we can get a lot more specific than that, even just using Ezekiel 27 as I think Phils has done very productively. There are a bunch of evaluations of this text. You can come up with different numbers of circuits. I don't think the idea is to map this perfectly, since trade was going to be dependent on the product, on the weather, on the markets as they change. But just to sort of visualize, if we're trying to map general trade routes that connect Phoenicia with the rest of the world, actually there are at least 3 different inland trade routes that might have taken riverine routes into Mesopotamia, Transjordanian sort of Levant into the Arabian Peninsula, and an Anatolian circuit, which at certain times of the year could have been seaborne, but was probably also overland. So we have a lot of new data coming out of maritime programs that show us the sort of graduated or stopping over pattern of trade in the Mediterranean in this first millennium BCE environment. And certainly from Phoenicia in particular, it's clear that in our Levantine city-states, there is an idiom that expresses sort of calls this part of the Mediterranean Sea an Egyptian Sea, the Egyptian Sea, right? You go this way precisely because Egypt is such a common and lucrative trading partner. So that we know for sure, this involvement would have been multi-pronged, evolving, and complex. And when summaries like Sauter's synthesis are trying to present a picture of how Phoenician trade worked, it's clear that we still have a lot of questions, but in general, it's certainly a mix of royal city-state sponsorship, right, drawing from the evidence that shows how wealthy kings became in periods where their services or their ships were needed. Private mercantile business not connected to the state. We absolutely know there are families operating without approval or taxation as far as we have records from those city-state kings. And probably also cooperative measures of an intermediary status. So I'm imagining professional organizations, especially in these communities abroad, but also potentially clan-based groups, sort of kinship-based groups that are banding together to create larger fleets, to draw folks with multiple skill sets, to be able to shrink or expand the size of a particular set of an expedition when needed. So all three of these are probably in play when we're thinking about how trade worked on the ground. In particular, I'll just draw one more sort of piece of evidence here from Arrian, and this one is my translation. In this particular example, Alexander has taken his soldiers through a desert probably in what is today Pakistan, but potentially southeastern Iran or southern Afghanistan, right? This sort of dry desert plateau. This Gadrosia desert, you have larger than average trees, and this is how it puts myrrh resin along the way. And they're moving with the army. They are gathering a product, and it sounds like this is not a regular trade journey. So there's a great deal of it since it exuded from thick branches. I don't know how to translate this. This is myrrh trees are sort of more like shrubs, trunks, I don't know, exuded from thick branches and has never been gathered before. Probably a little superlative or a little exaggerated, but the idea is the Phoenicians themselves hadn't been on this particular route. They are accompanying the army. They see an opportunity to have a protected foray into some new markets or some new access to raw goods. And so they collect myrrh resin and spikenard plants. Spikenard's related to I can see Pete, I think your mic is on. Yeah, nice. Spikenard is related to the honeysuckle, but it grows a kind of underground stem or root that has a bunch of oil. So that particular scented aromatic oil was probably like myrrh, a very expensive aromatic that the Phoenicians gather. And then they actually load it up and leave. They separate from the army, right? So it's not clear in this case that these traders are being paid to be there. It seems like they are their own, this is an expedition to obtain new goods for new markets. Okay, so moving from long distance trade into these established cities abroad where minority communities in the diaspora can be studied. This is just a little Google map I made showing you where the evidence I'm going to discuss comes from. Memphis in Egypt, Rhodes and Delos, Athens and Piraeus, and Demetrias in Thessaly. Delos in particular, in the 2nd century BCE, this is a late period community where it became an open port, and we get just a surge of Hellenistic period epigraphic data. But where we have good quantifiable data, it seems as though the Semitic speakers in Delos represent themselves according to their city-state of origin. And those city-states of origin are not they're sort of unequally present on Delos. There's also a community of folks who identify themselves as Syrians. We don't know a lot about them, what that means, how that is distinct in this particular community from, for example, where's modern Latakia, also in Syria, or Antakya. I didn't notice that those are rhymey. In Turkey. So there's some interesting sort of size comparisons that can be made. Of course, these are just folks who are represented in epigraphic data and have both a name and a city of origin. But this is a fun little snapshot of one immigrant community. In terms of thinking about that strong group consciousness sustained over time, or a sense of kinship with diaspora members in other countries, we can sort of speculate about some of that going on simply by finding these communities that identify with Levantine cities near one another at an open port city. But I'd like to theorize this a little bit more. So I'm going to walk you through, with my last few minutes, 6 features of Phoenician and Punic diaspora communities, and just a piece of evidence for each. So I'm hoping this will be sort of productive for discussion afterwards. So the most famous feature of these communities are name-changing conventions, and we get a variety of name-changing decisions. You can transcribe your name into the dominant language of your community. You can modify your Phoenician-sounding name for linguistic conventions like foreign Greek endings. You can translate your name, including perhaps picking an equivalent of your theophoric element, or you can choose a distinct name. And so here's an example of the last phenomenon, a bilingual tomb inscription from Demetrias, where we get Abdi, right, my servant or my slave, as equivalent as the same person as Demetrios, a name derived from the goddess Demeter, not related at all. This is an example of someone who has a Phoenician name and has a Greek name and uses one of each as they do their trading and working. And so these, you'll see throughout the examples more variation in name-changing conventions. Second feature, of course, bilingual inscriptions themselves. The fact that you have in your tombstone 2 separate audiences that need addressing is an interesting phenomenon. And I would add that these are distinctly targeted adaptive bilinguals. In other words, yes, they represent full bilingualism from folks who were probably speakers of both languages and not simply paying someone to translate. We have bilinguals from across the Aegean world, in addition to in Egypt and so on. Here's the example that I think is not well known. This is a votive inscription, or a votive statuette of Harpocrates. In Egyptian, on one side only, you get an Egyptian inscription giving our giver as Usank and his father's name as Pethi. The other 3 sides have duplicate Phoenician inscriptions. And though they call the god by the same name, here our dedicant is Amos, or Amos, son of Eshmunyaton, son of Azar Milk. And you'll see this, fuller genealogy comes into play. I would add that those targeted adaptations, we can get more specific with a 2-pronged definition, that are outward-facing texts for languages in the dominant, for inscriptions in the dominant language, emphasize the city of origin. And sometimes that's the only information you're given about, especially in a tombstone inscription. In this case, in the Phoenician inscription, there is no city of origin given. And then on the other hand, the inward-facing texts, the texts for other Phoenician speakers, tend to emphasize genealogy. And you've already seen that in a couple of these very quick examples, but here's another one. You have a single name as city of origin in the Phoenician text. We're going to know about your dad, your grandpa, your great-grandpa, and that whole line of folks traces their lineage back to Kition in Cyprus. There's even been some suggestion that the one Phoenician papyrus letter that we have from Saqqara is an example of 2 Phoenician speakers who call one another sister, not because they are kin, but because they consider themselves part of one community. And there's some detailed evidence about why that's been interpreted this way. It's a marvelous letter between two women. Tell my sister, your sister Basha, or Bisha, said, "Are you in good health? Me too, I am. How are you doing? I'm fine." And there's some interesting interpretation of the religious syncretism here as well. Blessed by a Phoenician Baal Saphon, or Levantine Baal Saphon, as well as all the gods of Tel Defene, which is also in Egypt. In any case, we have, I think, some good evidence for cross-city-state kinship and fellowship. So in particular, this very famous bilingual, the lion stele from the Kerameikos cemetery in Athens, has a bilingual epitaph at the top. "I am Shem, the Ashkelonite. This is the stele which Damsele, the Sidonian, erected." Right? In Greek, we get the same. The dead person is from Ashkelon. The good friend who not only buried his friend, but also shoved a lion off of his corpse, more on that later, that Sidonian dedicated this stele. So acting on behalf of someone from another city-state, but from perhaps the same perceived diaspora community. Iconographic adaptability. Becky Martin is someone who's done a lot more on this than me, but certainly you see examples of steles that completely adopt a Greek koine in iconographic representation. And like this lion stele, one that is, and sorry that maybe I need to show you this version of it, it's such a bad image that the epigram at the bottom in Greek only has to spend some time explaining what the heck this is. So the epigram says, "Let no man wonder at this image. I know this drawing sucks. On the one side of me depicts a lion, on the other side of me the prow of a ship. My friend warded the lion off, buried me in this tomb, etc., etc." This has to be explained to a Greek audience. It is so weird a scene and so unexpected a set of conventions. But I would argue in all of ancient Near Eastern art, we get very few depictions of a dead body at all. One of the only other ones I know of is also from Phoenicia, it's an unprovenance piece from near Sur. It actually came out of a refugee camp, so the provenance is okay, it just wasn't documented in situ. It's held by the Beirut National Museum, and it shows an anthropoid sarcophagus with two mourners nearby. And fascinatingly, this folded garment here, this pillow on this sort of presentation bier, very similar ideas and very rare in the rest of the ancient Near East. Religious syncretism, similarly complex, similarly fuzzy. I know we don't like the word syncretic anymore, but riddle me this. How else do you interpret a Phoenician daughter, a Phoenician woman here from Sidon, who has a stele set up by Yatan Baal, chief priest of the god Nergal? Now, Yatam Bahal sounds like a pretty Phoenician name. He's got a pretty Phoenician sounding dad, could be a husband, could be another sort of cross-city-state kinship agreement. But in any case, he's the priest of a Mesopotamian god. So syncretism here, I don't mean selecting a Greek name for a goddess that's sort of like Ashtart. I mean active in the cults of deities from outside of the Levant. And finally, city-state identity becomes used as a sort of added branding value in certain products. And I would say especially in terms of glassmaking. So we don't have time to get into all the evidence, but I love this little piece that I got to visit at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, in which we've got Greek and Latin, sort of bilingual molded stamps on this end of a vessel handle, sort of indicating the artist's name, Arta or Artas, who is a Sidonian. So glassmaking, especially in the late Hellenistic and Roman period, becomes closely associated with certain city-states. So these are functional not just in selecting an in-group identity, but also in adding value eventually to out-group markets. So all of this supports Josephine Crowley-Quinn's big picture point about increasing popularity of the Phoenicians and of the idea of being Phoenician in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, which does not always mean the widespread embrace of a collective Phoenician ethnic identity, right? In fact, she says the coastal cities continue to focus on their competing claims to the newly renowned Phoenician colonies and heroes and origin stories and skills. But I think that this picture, based in diaspora theory and emphasizing some articulatable features of the Phoenician diaspora community in the first millennium BCE, might be productive in adding more texture to that picture. So thanks for your attention. Sorry to go a little bit over, and I look forward to questions.